to thank everybody for being here, and I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's always a privilege to be here. I always enjoy coming back to New Harmony, and it's a privilege to be in this library as well. One of the great libraries in southwestern Indiana, if not the whole state, along with Willard, of course. They're almost the same age, the buildings anyway. So anyway, I thank you, and tonight I'll be talking about, has anybody heard of Rosamond Dale Owen before?
Yes.
Okay, well good. She used to be almost an unknown. She was pretty much lost in the shuffle of all the Owens who lived here, especially throughout the 19th century. One of her grandfathers, Robert Owen, one of his greatest legacies was, even though he was not here that long and departed the town, he did leave his 4 adult sons and daughter here. They all married, all had children, and for generations there were many Owens here. And I'm glad I don't have to do their genealogy because they repeat the names Dale and Owen. It's very hard, it's tricky, but very interesting. It's one of the most interesting families I think I've ever studied. When I was a student at USI years ago too, I also took the Dr. Pitzer's course. You probably know Dr. Donald Pitzer very well. He's a good friend of the library here too. And that got me even more interested in New Harmony. So I jumped at the chance to take the position at the State Historic Site, and it was there that I encountered Rosamond. And one reason she stood out was because she's very quiet. Not much had been said or written about her. And that sort of caught my interest. And we were developing an exhibit on the Minerva Society back then. She was a member of that. And out of all the young women in that group, she still stood out, and I kept digging and digging and finding more and more information. And now I have a whole file cabinet at home full of records and things that I hope someday to put in book form. But for now, I'd just like to introduce her to the general public, especially those who are interested in history, and especially New Harmony history. Like her grandfather before her, she was definitely an Owen. Not just physically, she strongly resembled her father, Robert Dale, physically, who resembled his father, Robert Owen. But it wasn't just a physical resemblance. She inherited the Owen interest in humanitarian issues, the compassion, the generosity, the desire to uplift society and make things better. And like her grandfather before her, she left the comfort and security of her home here, where she's surrounded by family and friends, and she loved living here. But something prompted her to leave almost midway through her life and set off to another continent in search of her own utopia. And she did end up founding her own little colony, just as her grandfather did when he came over here in the 1820s. So there's some interesting parallels here. And I'll give you just, sort of an outline of her life. There's so much more I could say, but it would take days. I have found so much information, so many records. I've been researching her for a long, long time, and they just keep adding new records online. I've been to several archives. Everywhere I think there's a lead, I explore it, and I keep coming up with a lot of information. This picture here that you see is of Haifa in Palestine in the late 19th century. In the background you see the little hamlet, little town of Haifa, as it looked pretty much then when Rosamond, or Rose, Miss Rose as she was known in New Harmony, I'll probably use those names interchangeably. That's the way it pretty much looked at the time that she went there for the first time. I don't know how much you know about her life at this point or why she was there, but I will explain that. Rosamond's journey begins in 1846, the year of her birth, December 13, 1846, as she recalled in her autobiography. That's one of the main sources of knowledge about her. Not many books have been published. I think a graduate thesis from an IU student back in the early 1990s. Other than that, you had to dig around and sort of cobble together her life story. But she did write her own autobiography, published in 1928, towards the end of her life, so it covers a long span of years, and it has a lot of interesting information, of course. It's not your typical autobiography, it's not chronological. She jumps around here and there, and then she goes off on philosophizing about something. She had some, I'll be polite to say, eccentric views when it came to certain subjects like religion. But anyway, after you've read it, you know that you've learned a lot about her. She does mention that on the day she was born, it was a Sunday, and the church bells were ringing in New Harmony, which seemed to foreshadow her later transformation from a, I guess you could say, agnostic into a very fervent Christian, which I'll get into a little bit more later. I found this view of New Harmony online a year or so ago. I'd never seen it. It belongs to a library up in the northern part of the state, and it looks to be at the late 19th century, which was, of course, after she was born, but would have looked pretty much the way it did the last time that she did visit New Harmony, looking towards the Wabash River you see there. I thought it was a very nice view. She talks very reverently of the mansion, as she calls it, the Robert Dale Owen mansion, as it's known. It took me a long time, years and years, to discover where this building actually was. Was it the one she even lived in? Where was the mansion? I thought it was in another building in another part of town, actually. And then I happened to come across a copy of it's a very large volume, Look to the Distaff, which was compiled by Caroline Dale Baldwin Allen. And it was just a treasure trove of information. And I learned a lot of new things about the Owen and the Dale side of the family that I've never seen anywhere else. And this is the only place I've seen this image. And apparently, after consulting with several people, I found that it was probably located on East Church Street. Built in the 1830s after Rose's father returned to New Harmony after several years' absence. He had married in New York, brought his bride back to New Harmony, built this very large house, and I guess one of the reasons for it was that all the Owens, they had married and they all lived under the same roof. So it was a lively place, and she talks about that with great affection and all the things they did together. It was really her mother's empire. Her father was gone a lot, he traveled a lot for politics and other reasons, and her mother sort of ruled the roost. She talks about the strict regimen there, and just recall a lot of good times. I think this building began to be dismantled maybe in the 1870s and actually was divided up into a number of other buildings at some point. It's obviously no longer there, but it's just sort of interesting to picture it. All right. These are some nice pictures of her parents, Robert Dale Owen, and her mother. There aren't many. There's not really a whole lot of information about her mother either. I pieced some together enough to get an idea of who she was. Her parents had met in New York. Robert Dale was addressing a group, always talking about one cause or the other. And his future wife was sitting in the audience, and she was very young then, maybe a teenager. And according to Rosa, she went home that night and told her mother, "I just met the man I'm going to marry, even though he's the ugliest man I've ever seen." And so, And he basically said the same thing to a friend in a letter to a friend as well. Well, she's not really the prettiest woman you've ever seen, but anyway, they married, came to New Harmony, had a very long, happy marriage, several children. And Rose was the youngest daughter. He had 2 daughters, 2 sons that lived to adulthood, one who died fairly young, maybe age 5, one who died in infancy. But she was the last surviving member of that family. There's a collection up at the Indiana State Library of Robert Dale Owen's papers, and there's a quote, that quote at the bottom is from a letter that I read when I was up there. And she says to her father in 1874, this is not too long after her mother has died, and it was a huge blow to the family. Her mother died, I take it fairly unexpectedly. She was only in her late 50s. And Rose, who adored both of her parents, talks about this a bit, and it definitely changed the family dynamics. But she says, we ought to be good, for we have been well born and brought up. We have had a rare chance in this world. She's not bragging. She's talking about how appreciative that she is of what she has inherited from her ancestors, from her parents, from her grandfather. She knows that they're special, and by being good, she doesn't mean being kind to her neighbor, but trying to take her talents and whatever she has and to take on the big task of uplifting society. She wants to do good. She wants to make things better, like many in her family did. And I thought that was sort of a special remark. Her father, of course, lots of books have been written about him, so I won't linger on him long. And most people know who he is, I think. The eldest son of Robert Owen, social reformer. He did a lot for women in the mid-19th century. In fact, he was recognized with a bust at the state House legislature in 1911. A politician, friend of Abraham Lincoln. He seemed to know everybody. He was a household name in his time. Author, prolific author, and also in the latter part of his life, a spiritualist. And of course that was a movement that was really sweeping the United States and Europe and elsewhere, I guess, in the world at this time. But he was really caught up in it, as his own father had been towards the end of his life, and other members of his family, his daughter Rose, and and his wife, Mary Jane Robinson, family originally from Virginia, moved to New York where he met her. She was a descendant of the English religious dissenter John Robinson, who had led a group of dissenters out of England in the 1600s, I believe, over to Holland, and was part of that group that came here to the United States, the first group that we call the Pilgrims. He did not live; he died before that came over, but obviously some other members of the family did. So Rose has lots of options when it comes to religion. Sometimes Robert Owen has been called an atheist. They've been called agnostics, free thinkers, all sorts of things that didn't exactly appeal to the general population at the time. As I mentioned, her main job was to manage the household. She taught Rose. I don't know if they were in schools in New Harmony that early. I don't know if they were in school buildings, but most children were taught at home. But she did become a pretty well-known suffragist, possibly because of her connections to New York. But she was a good friend of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were the top, probably 2 suffragists in the United States at that time. And she apparently did travel back. That's my only clue, that apparently she did go back to New York at times. She still had family there anyway. Another quote by Rosamond on her home life: "It was indeed a gay and innocent little Arcadia over which my beloved mother wisely presided." At times she said they lived in a sphere of innocency here, that they just sort of lived in their own little bubble and everything was fine. She talks about evenings when all the family gathered and they would play music, they would sing. The mansion was lined with books, the walls were lined with books, there was artwork. They were a very cultivated family. I don't think they were ever really wealthy, but they were comfortable, at least for a long time, and were able to do things that probably some people, some Americans, were not able to do, such as traveling, education, things like that. After her father passed away in 1877, she had traveled with him. She was pretty close to him her whole life and did some traveling with him. And after her mother, I think they became even closer. But he ended up remarrying towards the end of his life, a move that she didn't really approve of. And he died in New York and was buried there. After 1877, she was pretty much on her own. And she was starting to get up there a little bit, I think, in her 20s, getting close to her 30s. And this was not too typical for a young woman at that time in Victorian America. You're supposed pretty much to, or expected to get married at some point. She did have a suitor here, and apparently it was a fairly long relationship. And she mentions him in her autobiography, but not by name. And it took me a while to track him down, and I did. And he was born here. He's a native of Posey County. Dr. William Allen. He was a Civil War veteran. He went to medical school, I think in Michigan, became a physician. He sounds like a prize catch, but she kept putting him off. She just felt uncomfortable at the prospect of marrying. That eventually came to an end after attending a seance with her father in Boston. She said he was more of a beef and potatoes type of man, and all I wanted to think about was earth and heaven. So you can sort of see how they might collide at some point. There are still several buildings in New Harmony standing that are associated with her, such as, of course, St. Stephen's Church, where I was a little bit surprised. At Willard Library, we have lots of church records that have been microfilmed. And I was flipping through them a few years ago, and there was her name in 1859 getting baptized, along with several other members, mostly children, I think, of the Owen family. And she was baptized by Dr. James Runcie, who ended up marrying her close cousin, Constance Fauntleroy, and who had accompanied Rose to Europe in the 1850s when Robert Dale Owen was appointed to a diplomatic post. Rose spent 5 years there, the family spent 5 years there, and she came back with much better educated and proficient in German and French, I think. But they came back, settled in, and a wave came over them, I guess, of religious fervor, and several of them were baptized. Even though later on, and throughout her whole life and all of her writings, if she has anything critical to say about anything or anybody, it's about traditional Christianity. And she's a pretty calm, even-keeled person and not critical of most things. But she did mention several times that I just can't stand to sit in a church. It's just too cold, there's no feeling there. I don't like it. So she developed her own religious philosophy over the years. If any of you have ever read her large tome, The Mediators, which was published posthumously. She worked on it over 40 years. You will understand. I know at least one person in here has tried, and it's a little hard to follow, but of course, Union Hall, or what we might call the Opera House today, has gone through several name changes, of course. Her name appears frequently in the New Harmony papers as having appeared there for different reasons, performing in plays, sometimes with Bella Golden, singing, playing instruments. They were a musical family, sometimes playing for a fundraiser, not just for the recreation of it, but, for example, to raise money to buy a new organ for the Episcopal Church. So she was very active in the community, liked to get out. In her own words, she was self-effacing, reticent. She claimed, even though she had lots of cousins and friends as a child and played with them, that she really preferred solitude. She said as a child she cried herself to sleep at night because she thought of all the world's sins and folly. She was not your typical child, I don't think. And of course, you recognize this building. These images I'm showing you of these buildings here come from the Fauntleroy collection at the University of Southern Indiana, the archives there. William Fauntleroy, who was the brother of Mary Emily Fauntleroy, took a lot of pictures of New Harmony in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they're really wonderful to look at. In fact, there were so many, several of the library, I had to pick one of them. And I like this one. It was obviously taken soon after the new library building opened in 1894. You see the trees are small. It just has a new look to it. It had just opened about the time she came back to New Harmony for her last visit in the 1890s. She did help to found the Women's Library Club that existed, I think, till 1986, if I'm correct. She helped draft the Constitution for that, and just re-immersed herself into life here again in the relatively short time she was here. And of course, the Fauntleroy home, the way it looked until the recent restoration. But that's the way it looked when it was the home of the Minerva Society, which she joined. But it was difficult for her to join. She was quite young, maybe 12 or 13 years old. And even though her father, Robert Dale, had drafted the first Constitution for this group, they rejected her as a member, and she had to reapply, and she finally got in. This is probably pretty much the way it looked when the young women met. There was a group of 27 women who met between 1859 and it was founded in 1863, probably pretty much dissolved because of the Civil War. I don't think the reason is really clear. As Constance Fauntleroy Runcie, who founded the Minervas, inspired by her trip to Europe with Robert Dale and the kids when he was a diplomat. And she wanted to introduce the young women, many of whom were pretty well educated for their time, to new ideas. They composed essays and poems, things like that, and got up in front of each other to recite them, which was a good experience for them at the time. These are nice images. These are from the State Historic Site. The one on the left is probably the earliest one I've seen of her, and I'm guessing that has to be the 1860s. She's a young woman, and it looks pretty much like Civil War dress that she's wearing. And there she is on the right. That's more of a formal studio portrait. She's well dressed. She looks confident. And these were pretty good years for her. In the mid-1860s, I think after the war ended, after the Minerva Society had dissolved, she went to New York for a couple of years and finished her formal education. So she was pretty literate. She was a voracious reader too, and decided she wanted to be an author. In writing, like her father did. He published books, he submitted lots of articles to magazines such as the Atlantic Monthly, and she followed along with him and had several things published, mostly fiction. As she begins to mature a little, she enters yet another phase of her life. You can see her hair is graying here. I'm trying to keep up with her, the time period here. She does look a little grim in some of her pictures, a little serious-minded. But she really had, I don't know, she was really lighthearted and had a positive outlook on life. Obviously, her mother's death, as I mentioned, was a blow to the family and to her. About a week after her mother died, she had a vision at the gate to her house. This wasn't the first one. Throughout her life, she claimed to have had visions or heard voices. She would call it the voice, capital V, which she has mentioned in her writings. Even from childhood, she claimed. And they helped guide her. But she was distraught over her mother's death, and probably about that time or soon after, she had an accident. It was a simple accident, falling off a ladder. But she was injured, and for the next 9 or so years, she had back problems, was partially paralyzed, and was practically blind, which meant she couldn't read, which she loved to do. So there was a good block of time that was not so good for her. However, even though while her father was still alive, a few years after her mother died, she did continue to travel with him, I'm assuming with assistance. But it was also during this time when she was trying to make up her mind whether to marry or not. And she says in her autobiography, I thought if I waited it out, then he would lose interest and go away. She was too nice to tell him, I don't think I want to marry you. That didn't happen, so she went to consult her father, and he said, let's go to a seance, and she claimed she received a message to break it off. He left New Harmony, apparently never to return. He moved out west and died out there, never married. So, sort of a tragic story, but that just is not the biggest, most important thing in her life at the time. The Transfiguration refers to, I would say this is one of the first, there were a couple of major turning points in her life. And this occurred in 1882. And it happened literally at a church called the Church of the Transfiguration in New York City, where she frequently traveled to visit with her cousins on her mother's side of the family. And one of her cousins had been coaxing her into going to church on a Sunday morning, and she didn't want to go. She didn't like formal church services, but she ended up going, and she said that she was sitting there with a moral ramrod up her back. She said just stiffly. She wasn't enjoying it, but all of a sudden she saw a huge vision over the altar of Christ, and it made her jump up and run down the aisle and drop down at the altar. And from that point on, her life was totally transformed, and she became deeply religious, not in the conventional sense, but she studied religion, the scripture, anyone who wrote about religion. She studied Darwin. She attempted to reconcile science and Christianity. That's the simplest way I can put it. It gets very complex, and I'm not going into it, but she was deeply religious and believed in Christ after that. She had not prior to that. Spent a lot of time in meditation and writing. and so forth, just changed her life. And about that time, she started on what became her longest book. She had other little publications off and on throughout her life, but The Mediators was around 1,000 pages. And I'm not even sure if it was finished then, but because it was published posthumously. But it's very helpful to read because at the end it contains many chapters, and at the end of each chapter, because she has written it over all these decades, and she has moved around a lot in the world. She soon adopts a very nomadic lifestyle. You can sort of track where she is, what part of the world she's in at what time, which is very helpful. Well, in my case, when I'm researching her. She becomes more interested in social causes, reform, sort of like some of her forebears. In this case, the woman question, simply because she was a woman and thought they should get the right to vote and other things that were being addressed in those days, but because she thought women played the most important part in cleansing society, that they had a greater moral influence, which was sort of the typical thought during Victorian times. And dress reform, that's a different issue, and I think she's wearing a dress that she became sort of famous for. She abandoned the corset and other things that were common to fashion back then, and it was just a long, loose flowing gown. In fact, there was an article written up in one of the New York newspapers about, they called it the Dale Owen gown, and they described it as just something quite different. In the early 80s, for a couple of years, something like 1884 to 86, she went to England to visit some relatives, some of her mother's relatives there, and found out that an aunt had booked her for several speaking engagements, and she was painfully shy. She was not a people person, and she was horrified to find out, but she went and gave talks throughout England, even visited New Lanark, where her grandfather had his mill, and found that a lot of the workers there still remembered him and thought highly of him. She talked about different subjects, spiritualism, her grandfather's experiment here in New Harmony. She even talked about, I've seen a list of her topics, how to raise a child, which I don't know, since she never had children of her own. But she was raised in this family that did have a lot of children. Just a number of topics, and there are lots of notices of her in different publications and newspapers that she appeared here. She was making a name for herself, and the reviews were good. They said she was not at a loss for words, and a lot of these meetings were often packed to capacity. So she came back, and she was still in the developing stages of what am I going to do the rest of my life? What am I doing? Why am I here? What is my purpose? And I'll get to Sir Laurence Oliphant in just a moment, but first, the woman question. The newspaper clipping on the left I found in an Evansville newspaper. She was pretty well known there. If she traveled there, which apparently she did frequently, her name was written up. And she must be pretty much making her own reputation by this time, because this is one of the rare times where the article doesn't say Miss Rosamond Dale Owen, daughter of Robert Dale. She's no longer just the daughter of, but she has her own reputation. She was speaking at a equal suffrage society on Chandler Avenue, which is downtown Evansville, and that was just part of it. I cut off the article. About this time, she published A Woman's Work. It's a small booklet in which she addresses the so-called woman question, and she sounds a lot like her grandfather, Robert Owen, when he's talking about, when she's talking about cooperative kitchens. Despite new technology, women are still bound to the house, bound to the kitchen. How about cooperative kitchens where we could share time in there? More training, education was always important to the Owens. And then comes Sir Laurence Oliphant. If you aren't familiar with him and you used a computer, just Google that name sometimes and you'll probably get millions of hits. He was pretty much a celebrity in his time. It's one of those names that have been sort of lost to history now, but he was world famous. Born in Cape Town, South Africa. His father was a judge down there for the British government. Born in 1829. He became a diplomat and sent all over the world, serving in different capacities for the British government. He was also a correspondent for the London Times, so he saw a lot of things happening. He was attacked and almost assassinated in Japan. He was an observer of the Crimean War. He was everywhere, and he wrote prolifically, so he was an author. Member of Parliament, hobnobbed with the royalty, British royalty. Everybody knew him. He was the kind of person everybody wanted at their gatherings. But at some point, while he was in Parliament, he thought, there has to be more to life than this. He felt an emptiness. So he soon joined, it was a pretty bizarre cult that Brockton, New York, Brotherhood of the New Life, Thomas Lake Harris. That is a story in itself. And he remained in it for many years. And he lost his fortune there. He was stripped of that. And he was put out to the fields, literally, to do hard manual labor and other tasks that he was totally unaccustomed to. He eventually finally escaped. He had married by then a very lovely young woman. The leader of the cult had taken her and a few other women out to California to start another sect out there, and he finally extricated her from the cult. They escaped. They ended up in their final years, around late 1870s, early 80s, in Palestine. The Zionist movement was sweeping the Western world. The Jews were returning to Palestine. And there were many Christian Zionists who wanted to promote them. And he adopted that as his cause, and he settled in Haifa, which is now northern Israel, which is how Rosamond came into those lands. He heard of her and sent her a letter and came here to New Harmony to meet her in July 1888. She didn't know who he was, but within a few days he had talked her to going back to England with him. So they got on a boat, went back, and after spending a lot of time talking, she goes through all the conversations and everything that they had here and on the boat, and as soon as they land in August, they get married. Well, you think here's a new life starting for her, a new phase, but he becomes seriously ill days after the wedding, and he passes away around Christmas time of the same year. So they're only married about 4 months. So she finds out she's in a strange land, and that his friends are shunning her. They don't approve of her. She's not anything like his first wife was. She wears modest, almost shabby clothes, which was her style, which a lot of people didn't like. And she decides to head off to Haifa. Never been there. And she takes a few relatives from New Harmony, 2 nieces, the daughter Julie Dale, and May Cooper, and a few associates of his, and a few other people who had escaped that cult. And she starts the next phase of her life. There's another view of Haifa from a painting of that period. Down at the foot of Mount Carmel, those are monasteries on the top there. I don't have a pointer here. It was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire at this time, which was on the verge of collapse. Haifa. what is now northern Israel. Divided into lots of different districts, including, it seems the main one is Syria. So sometimes, when I first started researching her, it was confusing. That area was called Palestine, the Holy Land, Syria. I didn't know what was what for a while, but this map helped. In 1868, Haifa was just a little settlement, almost deserted, quite desolate. A very old, an ancient site, but nothing was much happening on it till 1868 when it grew very similar to the Harmony Society. In fact, they had connections with it. Landed in Haifa. They were religious dissenters as well. And they were part of the many groups going to this part of the world at this time because of the feeling that Christ's second coming was imminent and the Jews were returning and so forth. And they made a little oasis out of this arid, desolate land. That's their little colony, little stucco houses with red tile roofs. They planted orchards, trees, built hospitals, schools. It was quite advanced, and I'm sure it stuck out. And they built a few other settlements in Palestine as well. This is the way it looked in 1930. See how it's grown. Those little settlements. 1930. Rose made her last trip there, and I think 1934, the last of about 25 trips, so she was back and forth. So in her own lifetime, she could see the growth there. And about midway through this city here, ending about where that pier is, or whatever it is, the German colony is lost in that. I think a lot of it still remains. It's a touristy area now, so I know people who have been there fairly recently. She had inherited these lands, not just the house in the German colony, but he had owned other property, and there were also some lands on the other side of Mount Carmel. Megiddo, the Armageddon of the Bible, just a vast tract of land that became very, very valuable to archaeologists. But in this part of the world, the Ottomans were collapsing, the First World War, a lot going on, and it's very difficult for her, and especially as an American or even as a British subject, to get her rightful claim, the title. She had trouble getting the title to the land. That's a modern view of Haifa from the mountain, looking at street straight down is where the German colony is. That's the house. To this day it's called Oliphant House, where she lived. But only through the early 1900s she sold it. I'm guessing she had some money problems, no income. She had married briefly again. In fact, her first trip there, a few months after her husband died, in early 1889, is when she took the group and they set up in this house, and she wanted to form a colony, her own idea, her own version of Utopia. But it didn't last long. I'm guessing probably not even weeks. She said a lot of people didn't want to work, they didn't want to go outside, they just wanted to stay inside and eat. Lawrence's agent ran off with the money. There's this problem, so everything collapsed. And one of her nieces did stay with her for a little while until Julian, her brother, came over and got her, I think. There was this also controversy, the scandal, that what was going on here. The neighbors didn't know, the townspeople didn't know, and they thought it was an experiment in free love and all these things connected with communes and utopias and things like that. And she went back to Britain to answer charges before a National Vigilance Committee, to have to explain what she was doing, and apparently got off the hook. I'm sure she was very earnest and very serious about what she was trying to do, and probably at some point just thought, okay, just forget it. This was taken in December of 2016, so it's pretty recent. Taken by Dr. Jenny Ebling in the archaeology department at U of E, who hosted that symposium last fall here in New Harmony. She every summer goes on more digs over there on what was Rosa's former land. She reports that the house is deteriorating, it seems abandoned, and she's not sure what its future is. A little bit of detail, you see the German inscriptions, very similar to Harmonist culture. At this point, her second husband only lived a year or two. He was much younger than she was, but he died. He fell overboard. They don't know if it was suicide or what. So at that point, I think, she decided maybe I should give everything up, and she came back to New Harmony. So for a couple of years, or a year and a half or so, she was back here in New Harmony, and that's when she got involved with the library here and became editor of a publication at the church and just picked up where she had left off. But she, as she said, she felt the pull. She just kept feeling something to go back to Palestine. But she made no more attempts to set up her own little colony there. But she did write that she retired from the world and basically spent the rest of her life writing. She had sold her house in the colony, but at times resided on the top of the mountain with the nuns, writing, went back and forth between her home in Britain, or in England, and Haifa. The last man to play a major role in her life was Carlos Rosamond, and she met him shortly after she went back, after she left New Harmony in the mid to late 1890s, and he was with her the rest of her life. She adopted him. He always refers to himself, and she referred to him as the adopted son. I don't know if this was formal or not, but I assume it may have been. He was son of the French consul there. He was quite young when they first met. He could have been her son or younger. He had studied for the priesthood as a Jesuit. They had some violent arguments when they first met. How he came to live with her, I'm not sure of that connection. There are a lot of vague things in her autobiography, but they soon developed an understanding and both realized they were deeply interested in religion, and they settled down and lived in peace the rest of her life. She paid for his education, sent him to conservatories in Naples, Paris, London. He gave music lessons there in Worthing, England, where they lived in the latter years. So they gave a little bit of income back, and after her brother Julian died, she received a little stipend from his bequest. He had learned about 15 languages, apparently pretty bright, and came over to the United States in 1919 to a labor conference as an interpreter. She apparently never came back to New Harmony after the 1890s. I did find her in a passenger list indicating that she had come to the United States in 1915. Must have been New York, where she used to live a lot, where she had some family on her mother's side. I'm not sure, but apparently she never came back here. There's a picture of her and Carlos at her home in Worthing, England in 1910. It's on the south coast. In fact, they lived in the very last years right on the coast where you could literally see the ocean there next to you. You see all these musical instruments there. That's just one of her books. I bought that from a British bookseller. And then I went online and found out there's only one other copy in the library database, WorldCat. And once in in the Israeli National Library. That's a small book, but it's not the big one entitled just The Mediators. She always put Mrs. Laurence Oliphant, even though she had married a second time, his last name was Templeton, or she preferred her maiden name, Rosamond Dale Owen. Still, it always proud of the Owen name. In 1914, this is a clipping from an Evansville paper. She couldn't come back for New Harmony's centennial, but she wrote this little letter, and she said, I often wonder how Rose Owen of Posey County came to be domiciled among these Turks and Arabs, missing, always keeping in touch with everybody here, and a lot of family and friends from New Harmony went to visit her, and she was starting to get up there in years by then. She eventually was able, this was a very complicated matter and drawn out, but she was finally able to sell her land to the University of Chicago, who wanted to excavate it, and they found some real treasures there, stables of King Solomon from the Bible and so forth. She made enough to buy one nice home in 1931. She had led a very nomadic life, moved around a lot, but that was her final residence. And these pictures are from the collection of this library several years ago, showing her in Worthing in the 1930s. She was aging. That was a music student of Carlos. The other one shows apparently a relic that she brought back from Palestine at some point. She's quite old there. I don't know if she's meditating, what she liked to do, or if she's just hunched over and she has a cane. She finally passed away in 1937 in Worthing, and she bequeathed everything that she did have to Carlos. That record on the left here, I found that fairly recently. It's a death register. She wanted to be buried in Wales, in the same little town where her grandfather, Robert Owen, was buried. And in the corner there, on the edge of the page, somebody has written in, she's the granddaughter of Robert Owen, whose name apparently was still known there. Richard Leopold, who wrote probably the best biography of Robert Dale Owen, was excited to find out that she was still alive and living in Worthing in late 1936 when he visited her there. I'm sure trying to collect information for his doctoral dissertation. He was a student at Harvard. And he sadly reported that her mind was gone. She knew nothing. So she did die a few months later. I'm sure her family wanted her brought back here, but she, at her request, wanted to be buried near her grandfather. However, the following year, in 1938, there's a little dedication ceremony in Maple Hill. They did put a monument there, which is a near duplicate of what is at her gravesite in Wales. The only difference being basically, this one says she's the daughter of Robert Dale Owen, and the other one says she's the daughter or granddaughter of the great Robert Owen. So it's the great on there, but they're basically the same. And summarizes her life as an author, philosopher, traveler, ardent Christian. And her final words, according to Carlos, in whose arms she died, he said her final words were peace, peace. In her autobiography, even though she still had nearly another 10 years to live, you could tell she was becoming a little disillusioned, that she didn't see much hope for peace, much less anything based on her plans for a better world. But she's interesting to read about. She did try, like her forebears, to improve the world around her. That's Robert Owen on the left there, and her father. Some strong family resemblance. there, so yes. And I would like to thank these different institutions for letting me use their images. Does anyone have any questions, or?
So what was the difference in age with her and her adopted son?
Well, records are, I've been asked by several people about him. There is very little information. And I don't even know exactly when he was born. He did die, I think, in the mid-1950s, and I think his age was listed at about 80, or he was in his 80s. So I'm guessing he must have been born in the 1870s, and when he met her in like the mid-1890s, he would have been quite young, 20-ish. Maybe had tried the priesthood, decided it wasn't for him. It would be interesting to know his whole story, though. Why he left the priesthood, what happened to his parents. I don't know anything other than his father.
I just wondered if there was any indication that he was taking advantage of.
I don't think so. I've seen a little bit of his writing about her. He wrote a little bit in the introduction to The Mediators, which was published after her death. And he just writes glowingly and lovingly about her. She did, I did buy a second copy of her autobiography a couple of years ago, and I did that not because I needed a second one, but it said it came with some extra things. It says photos and correspondence, and I thought that's interesting. And it came from Britain, and there was a typed letter of her. She had typed and signed that was read after her death. She said, you know, don't read this, you know, until after I die. But she was bequeathing everything she had to him and saying, I hope you can live in this house. She called it a mansion, so he must have had a pretty nice home at the end after she sold all that property in Palestine. And apparently he lived there quietly, giving music lessons, I guess, until he died. Sometimes, on a rare occasion, I would find his name somewhere on a program, you know, participating in a concert or something, but I just really don't have enough to even piece it together. I think she mentioned he was also, well, his parents or his father anyway, I guess, represented the French embassy, but I think he had some Italian in him. He sort of looks like it in his picture. He could be, but they settled down, and most of the time they spent several decades together. It was apparently in peace and very harmonious for them.
You do know where the Dale came from, right?
Yes, that was, well, Robert Owen married Adele.
Yes.
That's right.
Helen.
Yes.
Her father was David Dale.
I'd like a very short explanation of spiritualism, if you would.
Okay. Well, I guess it still exists. I guess there are still people who call themselves that, but from around 1848, probably through the end of the 19th century, it was a big movement that swept the country. I think it may have originated in Europe, but basically spiritualists were people who attended seances. There were people who claimed to be in contact with the dead, and so they would hold seances. And apparently this became popular for several reasons. One I read was the Civil War around the middle of the century, which had been devastating to the country. Many lives lost, a lot of people in mourning, and spiritualism consoled them. It was a way that they felt they were communicating more directly with lost loved ones. And even though Robert Dale and his wife apparently became spiritualists, I think it became more pronounced in him after she died. And in fact, he was involved in a scandal. It turned out that the person holding the seances, I forget, this was either Boston or Philadelphia, it was a scam. You know, I'm sure there were some who were serious and thought they were communicating with the dead and helping these people, and some who realized, hey, this is a good way to make money. And it turned out that he got caught in that situation. It was in the headlines. He was shamed. He was embarrassed. And that's unfortunately toward the end of his life. And he ended up in the insane asylum in Indianapolis. He just fell apart. Rose was always taking up for him. She said, no, he's just there because he's overworked himself. You know, he's writing another book and he's just overwrought. You know, she's always defending him. She was always the good daughter. But anyway, it would be, I don't know, people, I guess we would call them fortune tellers today, maybe. They'll see a fortune teller and try to tell you what's happening. Or I don't know if they would emphasize so much the contact with somebody dead that you know. But anyway, there are lots of books on that. It was an interesting phenomenon. So, well, thank you all.